What's going on, guys? Scar coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. With the Zendikar Rising coming out in rotation, kind of shifting, I kind of want to go over some of my top 5 cards I'm going to miss as a whole in the standard meta, and some of the cards that are the top 5 cards I'm not going to miss as a whole. Some of these cards may be not just one specific card, but kind of like one card that helps a certain deck type kind of, flourish, and then there's other cards here that are just certain cards that stick out as a sore thumb. I'm sure some of them, if you think about what you're thinking of, I'm sure a couple of those cards are going to make my list for that. I also have a couple honorable mentions, just because why not have a top down list and not have some honorable mentions for each. But with that being said, guys, if you like this video, it definitely helps out the channel a lot. If you want to know when I post more videos like this, hit that subscribe button. But let's dive right into it. So coming into the first one here, we have Rally of the Wings. I know to some people this is a card that sticks out as a card that they may have disliked, but I actually kind of like this flying archetype as a whole in the standard meta. It was actually on the more budget friendly side for a newer player. I felt like the Rally the Wing style, Azorius Flyers deck was overall a very solid deck to play in MTG Arena, and there was a couple of good cards that the deck itself got as the sets got on. I know in M21 we did get that one bird that made all your birds cost one less, I think, and as well as whenever you played a flying spell, it got +1/+0, I think. I'm not 100%, but that's relatively how it was. But I actually think Rally the Wings was kind of like that one card. It was like kind of the Ember Cleave for the deck, because essentially the deck just kind of pecked your opponent for a little bit of damage, no pun intended. But Rally the Wings was like that thing, your opponent could be at 12 life, you have 4 or 5 flyers, they don't really have any flyer blockers, and all of a sudden, boom, you swing in, play Rally the Wings, and swing for that lethal damage. Like I said, I enjoyed this card because of its budget friendliness, in the sense that it made a budget Azorius deck oh so popular in a way. So moving on to my first card that I'm not the biggest fan of, but I know there's a lot of people who enjoy the mono white overall thing, but that was Ajani's Pridemate. Essentially, if your opponent was on the play and they were playing a solid life gain deck, Ajani's Pridemate is a card that was definitely annoying. Though I will say, when you do play the life gain deck and this card does go off, it's kind of one of those things that make you kind of like smile and go, oh yeah. But overall, a lot more times I was kind of on the receiving end of getting hit by a giant Ajani, and I had no way of essentially dealing with it. I know we did get the new cleric from the new starters and the mono white starter, but I think that one's a little bit more manageable because it starts as a 1/1. Ajani's Primate being a 2/2/4/2 and having the ability to kind of gain +1/+1 every time you gained life, I think is a little bit of a strong card. I mean, I'm not gonna say this warranted to be like a rare card, but overall this was one of those cards that definitely was kind of pesky, essentially, if you were playing against a deck that didn't have too much in the way of removal. Now moving on to the next card here, this is another card I did enjoy. I enjoyed the Flash archetype, and I think besides Brimo Cutthroat, we do lose a couple other Flash Flyers, or Flash cards in general. We lose the 1-drop Sailor kind of guy, which, essentially in the late game, you could always draw your card. But I kind of enjoyed the Brimo Cutthroat because kind of like, the mono white in Ajani's Pridemate, I felt Brimo Cutthroat was a little bit more interesting in a Flash style deck. I honestly think this was a little bit more balanced than I think the Pridemate, in the sense that it was a 2/1, and the fact that you have to kind of do something on your opponent's turn in order to make this bigger. I do enjoy the more reactive style decks, in the sense that your opponent plays something and the Flash style deck reacts to what they're playing, whether it's a spell to bounce back to their hand, to counter, and or possibly eliminate or remove a creature from the battlefield. With that being said, I do think Flash is in an interesting place. I think Rogues are going to be kind of the new kind of like flashy style deck, the Dimir Rogues or possibly Grixis, because of some of the new cards from Zendikar Rising. But this style, reactive counter spell style deck, is going to kind of be something I'm going to miss, but having a new style, having something to kind of replace it in the future with Zendikar Rising, I think is going to be kind of interesting. I just don't know how equal the two decks are going to be side by side when looking at it as a whole. But with that being said, I think Brimo Cutthroat is kind of a cool card. It was kind of like unique in a way of how it worked, and with that being said, I do enjoy this card very, very much. So with that being said, here is the second card on my cards I'm not going to miss. I kind of went with this card. I could have gone with a couple other cards in the mono red kind of style deck, but this is definitely one of those cards that I think is definitely going to be one of those cards I'm not going to miss, in the sense that it is Cavalcade of Calamity. This is one of those little pesky cards, I think, essentially, that if you weren't playing like the more Ember Cleave kind of style mono red deck. Cavalcade of Calamity was the other, but like the more budget friendly side mono red. But when it went off, kind of combine this with playing just multiple copies of it, and then also combine that with the dwarf guy. This is one of those little pesky cards that I'm not gonna miss looking out for, just because essentially it kind of more like filters down to like one style of mono red aggressive style deck in the format as a whole, which is I guess a good thing. But with that being said, I mean, there was a couple honorable mentions I think in the mono red that are also rotating out. Like Light Up the Stage is a card I'm not going to miss because that just kind of helped keep mono red on kind of that curve. But I decided just to go with the Cavalcade of Calamity because of its utility in this smaller micro mono red style deck. Now back to one of the cards I'm going to miss, and essentially this is kind of like I think one of those other interesting style deck cards that were pretty balanced in a way. I know there were certain decks that played Paradise Druid that made it kind of like not so balanced. You play like the Selesnya like Auras deck, and pretty much now you can make a Paradise Druid pretty much hexproof, and then have Vigilance, so it never has to tap unless you tap it for mana. But I think it's one of those cool things that kind of essentially helps protect at least one creature in a way, unless they have any more if they don't have a board wipe, or somehow a removal that kind of doesn't directly target it but targets the board as a whole. I think it's one of those things that, like, especially even a mutate is a good card, just because it's a card that you can mutate upon that has hexproof, so kind of protects your mutate card. With that being said, I mean, I completely understand why it's okay that this card's not going to be around. It's like decent to have a card that's relatively strong in a way because of the hexproof, but I mean, we do have other mana producers in the format. There's gonna be a couple more that come out I think in Zendikar Rising, but the idea of having just a target body that can just have hexproof as long as it stays untapped is just a good way to protect it until you really need to use it or tap it down for any particular reason. And every other one is kind of like, hopefully your opponent doesn't have a spot removal or burn spell or something like that to kind of get rid of it. But Paradise Druid is going to be one of those cards I'm definitely going to miss in that style of kind of protecting your mana ramp in a way until you're ready to kind of go out and ramp out into whatever you want to do. So with that being said, we're going to dive into the next one for one of the cards I dislike a lot, and that is going to be Narset, Part of the Veils. There's a couple, this War of the Spark style Planeswalkers I kind of dislike, Narset being one of them because it slows down any of those card draw style decks. I mean, granted, sure, card draw decks are kind of annoying, but Narset being able to be a 3-drop that has 5 loyalty, in my opinion, is a little bit strong for a Planeswalker for what it's trying to do. I mean, the idea that it slows down your opponent in the fact that they can't draw more than one card, and having the ability to -2 and essentially just looking at the top 4 cards of your library and find possibly the answer that you need to deal with whatever is going on the board kind of made it annoying. A lot of times this was very tough, especially when you played an opponent who was also playing a Teferi before he got banned. And I actually think a lot of the War Spark Planeswalkers are essentially like a little bit on the stronger side than typically. They're not very kept in check compared to where they should be for what they are. Having an uncommon that has like, I mean, sure, it only has a minus ability, can't get any stronger, but having an ability that's passive and is kind of like static across the board is kind of annoying. Teferi's was pretty much ruined the style of how Magic essentially works. Narset's is annoying, or Nissa's is annoying in the sense that it makes all our mana produce extra mana. I would say there's a few of the uncommon ones that weren't that bad. I don't mind, like, what is it, the mono red one, the 3 mana guy who makes the 1/1s, and whenever they die they deal 1 damage to wherever they want, and then essentially your opponent can't gain life. I don't think that's terrible. It's not really anything too prudent. I mean, life gain's okay, but I don't think that stopping your opponent from gaining life is really that essentially broken. I just think, like, if we look at overall these War of the Spark Planeswalkers, I think these kind of ruined like how the flow of Magic the Gathering really does play if we don't have them, and I'm kind of glad to see kind of them as a whole rotate out. So Narset, Part of the Veils is something I'm not going to miss, and or the War of Spark Planeswalkers. But let's move on to the next one. So the next card up in the deck list is actually going to be Knight of the Eben Legion. This is actually a card I'm actually kind of a fan of. I feel like it helps make mono black a little bit more aggressive, just essentially because a lot of the mono black cards you do see in the format as a whole start off as like a lot of 1/1s or 2/1s and stuff like that. And if you're playing like a little bit more of like a mono black tempo style deck, or even a mono black like, you know, devotion style deck, I think Knight of the Eben Legion was a good card. You know, at first you would think like a 1-mana 1/2 isn't that, you know, much to deal with, but you know, when you look at his ability, if our opponent lost 4 or more life this turn, you get to put +1/+1 counter on him, and you can tap 3 mana in the late game. If you don't have a play, you can always make him a +3/+3 and keep Death Touch, which makes him a good blocker in a sense that makes your opponent think before they swing in, especially if mana open mana. I just think it was one of those cards that kind of helped keep mono black in a sense, like with like the other style mono black decks. The one thing I would say I run into is like if I ever play like the current like 2021 style of mono black devotion style deck against like a mono green style deck that plays like Quest and Beast and stuff, it's definitely very hard for that deck to kind of, you know, block a Quest and Beast. And this is one of those cards that kind of help slow down that Quest and Beast. I mean, I haven't really looked at Zendikar Rising in a whole for what they're given to mono black outside of a few rogues and stuff like that, but I honestly think that when mono black loses this, when rotation happens, it's going to be one of those cards that kind of is definitely going to be felt. Like I said, there's probably a couple other mono black cards that are going to be rotated out. This is definitely one that sticks out to me as one I'll miss, and we're back to get into one that I'm not going to miss at all. So into another card that I am definitely not going to miss, and that is another mono black card, and that is Priest of the Forgotten Gods. I don't know how many people were frustrated when Rakdos Sacrifice used to dominate the format, and this essentially was that one card that made you really like, if you didn't, you know, just really made you like angry. I mean, sure, the cat oven was pesky and annoying, and kind of the clunkiness of that gameplay was kind of, you know, kind of slowed down the game as a whole. But the idea that your opponent can sacrifice 2 creatures, there's a chance that they may have stolen one of your creatures and sacrificed it to this, making you sacrifice another creature and essentially make you lose 2 life. They get to draw a card, and they get to float 2 mana to possibly play something. It's one of those pesky things if you couldn't deal with it, especially in the early game, and you played a little bit of a slower board presence style deck. This was one of those cards that really just drove you nuts, in the sense that if it got the upper hand on you, it was definitely hard to come back from, essentially, if you weren't able to deal with it in a way. You know, as you know, we kind of tailed off from, you know, the more recent bans in August. I kind of felt like Rakdos kind of lost its edge a little bit because of the lack of cat, just because, you know, that being able to repeat a creature out of your graveyard over and over again was kind of gone. But I think, you know, this card is still very good for what it is trying to offer. You know, just being a 2-mana 1/2 with this ability is very good, and there being a lot of ways to kind of cycle cards out of the graveyard with like Lurrus and things like that made this card still pretty strong. And, you know, with that being said, it is going to be one of those cards that I think will be kind of remembered as being a pretty good card for what it was, but it's going to be one of those cards that I'm not going to miss at all because of what it does. Especially, I feel like there's many times that I just got frustrated playing against a deck that was playing this style of card and or what it was trying to do with these cards. With that being said, now this is kind of like my one honorable mention. This is something I am going to miss, but I essentially think because it's a land, I don't think it to be factored in as important, and I'm kind of excited to see how these new Zendikar lands are going to play out in the format as a whole. But, you know, the shock lands as a whole are going to be something I'm going to miss, just because it kind of made playing your multicolored decks a little bit, you know, more aggressive than compared to playing like a monocolor deck. You know, it's going to be one of those things that I did notice in the 2021 format. If you got paired up against like a mono red style deck and you were playing a lot of tap lands, not having these shock lands were kind of like, you know, it kind of like frustrated you a little bit. And the fact that these lands also count for like, you know, forests or islands helped definitely helped with playing like, you know, your castles and things like that. Playing tap lands are just lands, which don't help. And I think, you know, the triumphs are okay in that sense, but they still come into play tapped. I think, you know, that there's a lot of power when it comes to like playing like the breeding pools and things like that in essentially all of Magic. And I definitely, like I said, you could feel it in 2021 Magic when it comes to playing multicolor decks, and how much clunkier they feel essentially compared to like playing like maybe a dual color deck or a monocolor deck as a whole. With that being said, these are cards I'm definitely gonna miss, but I just didn't think made like kind of my like top 5 of cards I'm gonna miss as a whole. And with that being said, let's dive into the next card. Honorable mention I'm gonna not miss come the meta as a whole. So this card, for the honorable mention of card I'm not gonna miss, is actually Mayhem Double. He didn't make like the top 5 list of cards I'm not gonna miss, essentially in that sense that it's not really a card that works well outside of a sacrifice deck, but he was one of those cards that definitely were pretty pesky if you were trying to do something, and it was just able, with the amount of sacrifice that Rakdos did have at one point, this was one of those cards I'm not gonna miss. You know, whenever a player sacrifices a permanent, so when you sacrifice and or your opponent sacrifices, this thing does damage, essentially making a lot of decks feel a little bit clunky. You know, if you sacrifice a Fabled Passage, now this thing's dealing 1 damage to one of your little small 1/1s, or it's dealing 1 damage to your face, which makes everything just that much more frustrating. Combine that with, you know, Priest of the Forgotten Gods, combine that with the Cat Oven style deck. This was one of those cards that also, you know, essentially frustrated me as a player. You know, Rakdos as a whole had a lot of tools, I think, in this current standard, and it was kind of like, not saying like, you know, when they lost Cat Oven it really lost a step. I mean, it did slow down this style of deck, but this deck was still pretty prominent, and you know, Mayhem Double was one of those things that made it fairly good and still work. So I'm not going to miss him as a whole, but it is a card that I think is going to be kind of like, you know, not missed at all, so it's all good. So the last card up is actually going to be the last card that I'm not going to miss at all, and that card is Casualties of War. So in the style of Magic that we are currently in, there's a lot of ramp, and you know, playing a deck that plays like Sultai, playing like these ramp style cards, Casualties of War is one of those cards that I kind of got frustrated with, because let's just say I'm playing like a deck that doesn't run any sort of ramp. Our opponent is possibly playing Casualties of War turn 4, turn 5 if they got really lucky with like Cultivates, Uros. If they played the bird or something like that, you know, they're really ramping up pretty hard, and essentially if they could cast the Casualties of War by turn 4, turn 5, it really just like, not even like on their turn 4, turn 5 when they already have 6 mana, it definitely slows down the game as a whole, and you know, makes it very frustrating as a player who's just trying to build something up. And you know, I think it's not essentially the card itself, because the card itself I think is pretty balanced on what it's trying to do, because if you do cast it on turn 6 for the 6 mana, I mean, good for you. You know, you did play a lot of good stuff on the board to get to this point, but I think just with the amount of ramp that, even with them, you know, banning a few cards to kind of slow down ramp, I think this card is one of those cards that takes advantage of you being able to ramp up just so hard. And it's definitely frustrating. I mean, I do enjoy the Sultai style control deck, but I just think, you know, essentially there's just too much to add into the deck to kind of just ramp up, which causes, you know, that sense of, if you're casting a 6 mana spell on turn 4 and your opponent's like just playing like their third, especially if you go on the play and your opponent's still at 3 lands, you're essentially resetting your opponent back down to turn 3 again when you play this, and you maybe have multiple copies of this in the hand, and essentially the game's already over before it's even began, because you're controlling your opponent and staying, you know, turns behind when you are just nicely ramping up into a nice smooth board, possibly to an Ugin, possibly to a giant, you know, giant flying snake, things like that. It just makes it very frustrating. I mean, I think it can be said by a lot of people that there's a lot of ramp currently in standard, and it looks like with, you know, Zendikar Rise, and it looks like we're going to be getting a lot more style ramp cards, take advantage of playing things like Uro, or just playing multiple lands on the same turn, because they're bringing back landfall, which is something that, you know, triggers when lands come into the battlefield. And I think, you know, essentially some people are just going to get really frustrated because of all the ramp. I mean, I think I saw one card that kind of slows down ramp, but it got to put in blue, and it's one of those things that if your opponent's not playing ramp, it's kind of like a dead card, because it just essentially penalizes them for playing more than one land a turn. But overall, you know, it's one of those things that I guess we'll kind of see how it plays out. Like I said, this is one of those cards I'm definitely not going to miss, and you know, Sultai ramp, to me, our Sultai control has kind of like, from what I played of the meta as a whole, this is one of those decks that kind of just frustrates me just because of all the ramp, and this is one of the cards that stuck out to me as being one of those cards that kind of made that you know, stick out to me. So the final card of the cards I'm definitely going to miss is not really essentially this card in particular, but it's essentially the style of deck, which is kind of like the elemental style deck, and Omnath was one of those things. I'm pretty excited for the new Omnath, but it unfortunately kind of plays into what I was just talking about with the ramp and stuff like that. But you know, the elemental style deck was a pretty cool deck, essentially just because I do enjoy like a good tribal deck. You know, Goblins is pretty cool in Historic. You know, I've, you know, dabbled in Merfolk in, you know, previous physical Magic and things like that, and I do enjoy like a good deck that comes together where there's like essentially a core element that works together. And with M20 they introduced a lot of elementals that kind of like trigger things off of each other, and with Omnath leaving, and you know, our little 3 mana crab guy that, you know, helps us, you know, make more mana onto the battlefield and things like that, I am gonna miss elementals as a whole essentially just because, you know, it's kind of stinks when you lose kind of like a tribal style deck. I'm not a big fan of the adventure style deck just because it's kind of annoying and really essentially is you know, all based on hopefully you draw in a lucky clover and kind of abusing the sideboard a little bit to kind of essentially, you know, sideboard it in. But it is a good deck regardless. You know, the party system looks to be kind of interesting, but I don't know how feasible it's going to be to get 4 things of the same, you know, 4 different types of creatures on the battlefield. So that's kind of one of those things. Cycling's kind of like in that weird kind of gray area where I kind of like it, but I kind of don't like it at the same time. Trying to think of what else is there. Mutate's a cool thing, but there's not really much in a way of protecting your mutate cards other than like preventing your opponent from bouncing them and things like that. But with that being said, guys, I mean, this is my list of cards I'm gonna miss and not miss from, you know, standard 2020 before rotation. Let me know what you guys think. If there's any cards that you are gonna miss that I didn't go over, let me know down in the comments below. I definitely would like to see kind of like what things you guys may or may not have missed or will be missing from the format as a whole. If you like the video, like I said, it helps out the channel a lot. If you want to know I post more videos like this, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you later.